June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watched the horizon with a cold, confident smirk from the bridge of the super battleship Yamato. To the Japanese High Command, the American carrier Yorktown was a ghost, a shattered wreck rotting at the bottom of the Coral Sea after absorbing a lethal dose of Imperial fire just weeks earlier. But as the morning mist cleared, a familiar, defiant silhouette emerged from the haze. Yamamoto's smile vanished. What he didn't know, what no one in the Imperial Navy could have imagined, was that American industrial logic had just performed a miracle. This is the story of how a dead ship rose in 48 hours to bury an empire. In the early months of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed the Pacific not as a battlefield of equals, but as a private lake waiting to be harvested. To the admirals in Tokyo, the American fleet wasn't a threat. It was a collection of second-rate compromises. They looked at their own Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, and saw masterpieces of naval architecture. Ships like the Akagi and Kaga were soaring cathedrals of steel, manned by pilots who had spent a decade perfecting the art of the kill. By contrast, the American Yorktown-class carriers appeared almost fragile. Japanese naval intelligence and seasoned commanders often spoke of these ships with a mixture of pity and derision. They mocked the American reliance on unarmored wooden flight decks. They sneered at the massive, boxy hangars that sat high above the waterline, making the ships look ungainly and top-heavy. To a Japanese officer trained on the philosophy of the decisive battle, where victory went to the most elegant and heavily armored warrior, these American vessels were little more than cardboard ships. "The Americans build their ships like they build their skyscrapers," one officer reportedly noted. "Light, hollow, and ready to burn." They believed a single well-placed 250-kilogram bomb, or a solitary Type 91 torpedo, would be enough to shatter the delicate American structures. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial philosophy. While the Japanese pursued the perfection of the individual weapon, the Americans were designing for something the Imperial Navy couldn't conceive: survivability through redundancy. The Japanese saw the Yorktown's wooden deck as a weakness that invited fire. They didn't see it as a deliberate design choice that allowed for rapid mid-ocean repairs. They saw the open hangar bays as a vulnerability. They couldn't imagine they were looking at an advanced ventilation system designed to vent the blast of an internal explosion. To the Japanese, a ship was either a masterpiece or a wreck. There was no middle ground. This cultural blindness peaked after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. When the Shokaku and Zuikaku returned home, their pilots reported the Yorktown engulfed in a hellish inferno. They watched the cardboard ship stagger under the weight of Japanese steel, listing heavily, its flight deck a charred ruin. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff checked the Yorktown off their list. In their minds, no ship could absorb that much punishment and remain a factor in the war. It was a mathematical impossibility in the Japanese playbook. They calculated that even if the Yorktown didn't sink, it would take at least 6 months in a major shipyard like Bremerton to ever see combat again. They were so certain of this death sentence that they didn't even bother to scout for her during the approach to Midway. They were preparing for a fight against 2 carriers, blissfully unaware that the cardboard ghost was already breathing again. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp was that in a war of attrition, an ugly ship that refuses to die is infinitely more dangerous than a beautiful ship that can't be replaced. Their laughter in the war rooms of Tokyo was about to be silenced by the sound of 1,400 hammers at Pearl Harbor. By May 8, 1942, the USS Yorktown was no longer a proud instrument of power. It was a 20,000-ton steel corpse drifting through the Coral Sea, bleeding lifeblood in the form of heavy bunker oil that left a black, shimmering trail miles long across the Pacific. The mathematics of destruction delivered by the Imperial Japanese Navy had been clinical and merciless. A 550-pound, semi-armor-piercing bomb had screamed through the flight deck, plunging 50 feet into the heart of the ship before detonating near the fourth deck. The explosion didn't just kill men. It vaporized the structural integrity of the vessel, shattering bulkheads and turning the intricate web of steam lines into a twisted, whistling nightmare of superheated gas. The damage report read like an obituary. The massive, cardboard ship had absorbed shock waves that distorted its very frame. 3 boiler rooms were flooded or out of commission. The flight deck, the ship's only reason for existence, was a jagged topography of splinters and scorched timber. Its internal radar systems, the eyes of the fleet, were blind, smashed by the violent vibrations of near misses that had buckled hull plates below the waterline. To the damage control teams crawling through the darkness and the stifling heat of 120-degree compartments, the situation appeared terminal. When the Yorktown finally limped back toward Pearl Harbor, listing heavily to port and smelling of scorched flesh and salt water, every naval architect on the Pacific coast reached the same conclusion. Under any conventional military logic, the ship was done. The repair estimate wasn't measured in days or weeks, but in seasons. The Navy Yard experts looked at the warped longerons and the shattered internal bracing and delivered a sobering verdict. 6 months, at minimum. The ship needed a total dry dock overhaul, a complete reconstruction of its internal power grid, and a massive replacement of its structural skeleton. In the brutal arithmetic of 1942, the Yorktown was a 0 on the American balance sheet. It was a broken dinosaur, destined for a scrap heap or a long, quiet death in a shipyard, while the Japanese Kido Butai moved toward Midway to finish the job. The Empire was laughing because they knew that steel has a breaking point, and they were certain they had finally found it. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the edge of Dry Dock No. 1 at Pearl Harbor, staring at a dying Leviathan. The USS Yorktown had just limped into the harbor, trailing a massive oil slick that stretched back to the Coral Sea. She was a wreck. A 250-kilogram bomb had punched through her flight deck and exploded deep in her gut, obliterating internal compartments and shattering her skeletal structures. The master shipwrights and engineers followed Nimitz, clipboards in hand, their faces grim. Their technical assessment was clinical and devastating. The cardboard ship was broken. To restore her to fighting shape, to rewire her shattered electrical veins and patch her ruptured hull, would require a minimum of 90 days. Even with a miracle, Bremerton was 3 months away. But Nimitz didn't have 90 days. He didn't even have 90 hours. Naval intelligence had already cracked the Japanese code. He knew Yamamoto's Kido Butai was steaming toward Midway at that very moment. The strategic mathematics were terrifying. Without the Yorktown, the U.S. Navy would face 4 Japanese fleet carriers with only 2 of their own. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Nimitz turned to the engineers. The air was thick with the smell of burnt fuel and stagnant harbor water. He didn't ask for a miracle. He demanded one. "We must have this ship back," Nimitz stated, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "I want her ready in 3 days." The engineers gasped. It was a request that defied every law of naval maintenance and industrial logic. To repair a fleet carrier in 72 hours was like trying to rebuild a skyscraper while it was still moving. It was impossible. It was insane. But Nimitz wasn't looking for perfection. He wasn't interested in the aesthetic standards of peacetime naval architecture. He understood a brutal truth of total war that the Japanese had yet to learn. He looked the lead engineer in the eye and delivered the punchline that would change the course of the Pacific War. "We don't need her perfect. We just need her able to fight." This was the birth of American good enough logic. While the Imperial Japanese Navy spent months obsessing over the finish and elegance of their warships, Nimitz was ready to weld raw steel plates over gaping wounds and ignore the scars. In his mind, a scarred carrier with a functioning flight deck was worth infinitely more than a perfect one sitting in a dry dock 2,000 miles away. The clock began ticking immediately. The order went out, and the industrial heart of Pearl Harbor began to beat with a frenetic, desperate energy. 1,400 workers were summoned. Power lines were dragged across the docks. The quiet of the evening was shattered by the first roar of 1,000 welding torches. Nimitz had placed the greatest bet in naval history on the backs of American laborers. He had gambled the fate of the Pacific on the idea that industrial grit could overcome tactical ruin. The Yorktown was still bleeding oil, but the American machine was now life support, and it was about to prove that a ship is only dead when the engineers stop fighting. What followed at Pearl Harbor was not a repair mission. It was an industrial assault. As the Yorktown settled into dry dock number 1, the quiet Hawaiian night was incinerated by the glare of 1,000 floodlights. This was the American machine shifting into overdrive, a raw display of logistical violence that defied every convention of naval engineering. 1,400 yard workers descended upon the ship like a swarm. They didn't just walk aboard, they invaded. These were men who had been working around the clock since December 7th, but this was different. They were fueled by a singular, desperate logic. Every hour saved was a hammer blow against the Empire. The air inside the hangar deck became a toxic soup of ozone, burnt paint, and sweat. Men worked in the dark, cramped double bottoms, knee-deep in stagnant fuel oil and sludge, welding patches onto a hull that was still radiating the heat of the Coral Sea. The mathematics of this recovery were staggering. To get the Yorktown back into the fight, the yard didn't just fix the ship. They rebuilt its critical systems on the fly. In less than 48 hours, crews replaced over 5 miles of shattered electrical cabling. They fabricated and welded 30 tons of new steel plating over the gaping wounds in the hull. The massive internal explosion had buckled the ship's skeletal structure, so workers installed massive timber shores, hundreds of heavy wooden beams, to physically hold the ship together from the inside. This was industrial might rendered in flesh and steel. While Japanese dockyards functioned with the meticulous, slow pace of traditional craftsmen, Pearl Harbor was operating with the frantic efficiency of a factory assembly line. There was no time for blueprints to be approved or for parts to be polished. If a pump was broken, they didn't repair it. They ripped a functioning one out of a different ship and welded it in place. If a bulkhead was warped, They didn't straighten it. They braced it with raw iron and moved on. By the 72-hour mark, the impossible had been achieved. The Yorktown's engines were screaming back to life. Her flight deck, which had been a scorched graveyard of twisted aluminum just days before, was now patched with fresh wood and steel. She was still trailing a thin ribbon of oil, and 300 civilian contractors were still aboard, welding as she moved toward the harbor exit. To any traditional naval architect, she was a mess. A scarred, patched-up cardboard ship held together by grit and timber. But to Admiral Nimitz, she was a miracle. She had absorbed a lethal blow and, through the sheer force of American industrial willpower, had been dragged back from the grave. As she steamed toward Midway, the workers on the docks watched in exhausted silence. They had given Nimitz his ship. Now the logic of the factory was about to meet the pride of the samurai, and the result would be total annihilation. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi led the second strike wave of Japanese torpedo bombers toward the American fleet. His mission was clinical: find the surviving American carriers and finish them. Just hours earlier, Japanese dive bombers had struck a massive blow against a lone carrier, leaving it dead in the water, wreathed in black smoke and oily flames. To the Japanese aviators, that ship was gone, a hollow, burning shell of cardboard and wood that no amount of prayer could save. But as Tomonaga's formation crested the horizon, his blood ran cold. There, sitting in the center of the American task force, was a Yorktown-class carrier. It wasn't burning. It wasn't listing. It was steaming at 20 knots, its flight deck clear, its anti-aircraft batteries manned and ready. Tomonaga radioed back to the flagship, "Hear you," his voice crackling with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. "We have found another carrier," he reported. He was wrong. It wasn't another carrier. It was the same ship. Japanese intelligence had calculated that the Yorktown was a corpse. Their pilots had seen the explosions. They had seen the fire. In the rigid logic of the Imperial Navy, a ship that suffered such catastrophic damage was out of the war for months. But American industrial logic had rewritten the rules. While the Japanese expected a ghost, they were facing a resurrected juggernaut. What followed was a moment of profound psychological collapse for the Japanese air crews. Tomonaga attacked with desperate ferocity, scoring 2 torpedo hits that finally caused the Yorktown to list 23 degrees. He died believing he had sunk a second, fresh American carrier. When a subsequent Japanese scout plane returned to the area an hour later, the pilot looked down and saw a carrier that appeared to be under power and recovering planes. "How is it possible?" the scout radioed, his voice trembling. "How can it still be here?" The psychological toll on the Japanese command was devastating. Every time they killed the Yorktown, she seemed to rise again, patched together by some invisible, unstoppable force. They felt like they were fighting a phantom that couldn't be buried. They didn't realize they weren't just fighting a ship. They were fighting a 24-hour repair cycle. They were fighting 1,400 laborers who had turned a shipyard into a weapon of war. The Imperial Navy prided itself on the one strike, one kill philosophy. But at Midway, they discovered that against American industrial endurance, one strike was never enough. For every hole they punched in the American fleet, a team of welders was waiting to seal it. The sight of the Yorktown, defiant and functional, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. They had expected a battle of samurai spirits, but they found themselves trapped in a war of machines that refused to stay broken. The laughter of the admirals had turned into a frantic, repeating question that haunted the Japanese radio waves until the very end. How can the cardboard ship still be alive? The miraculous survival of the Yorktown wasn't a matter of luck. It was a triumph of American damage control, a concept that the Imperial Japanese Navy treated as an afterthought, but the U.S. Navy turned into a rigorous science. While the Japanese focused on the offensive elegance of their ships, the Americans built their carriers around a brutal industrial philosophy. If it can't be indestructible, it must be repairable. In the Japanese fleet, damage control was often seen as the responsibility of a small, specialized group of sailors. When a Japanese ship was hit, the rest of the crew continued their combat duties, often leaving the fires to grow out of control until the ship was a lost cause. They viewed a sinking ship with a sense of fatalism. But on an American carrier, every single sailor, from the cook to the highest-ranking officer, was a trained firefighter and damage control specialist. The Yorktown was a masterpiece of over-engineered survivability. While the Japanese sneered at her cardboard construction, they missed the hidden mathematics of her design. American carriers were equipped with massive, high-capacity water pumps that could move thousands of gallons per minute, capable of countering a heavy list in seconds. They featured redundant electrical systems and specialized fire suppression networks that used fog nozzles, a technology the Japanese didn't possess, to smother fuel fires with a fine mist of water rather than splashing it, which only spread the flames. Perhaps the most critical difference was the American approach to aviation fuel. On Japanese carriers, fuel lines were often fragile and ran through the ship like exposed veins. When a bomb hit, the ship became a tinderbox. On the Yorktown, engineers had developed a CO2 purging system. The moment combat began, the volatile gasoline lines were drained and filled with inert carbon dioxide. This technical detail alone saved the ship at Midway. When Tomonaga's torpedoes struck, the fuel lines didn't explode into a volcanic eruption of fire. They remained silent, protected by the invisible shield of American logic. This was the ultimate expression of industrial pragmatism. The Japanese built ships to win a single, glorious battle. The Americans built ships to survive a prolonged war of attrition. They understood that in a conflict of this scale, the side that could take a hit, patch the wound, and stay in the fight would eventually bleed the other dry. The Yorktown was the living embodiment of this theory. She wasn't just a platform for airplanes. She was a complex, self-healing organism. The Japanese pilots had mocked her as a flying milk bottle. But they discovered that you could punch as many holes as you wanted in American steel. The system behind it was designed to never stop pumping. In the end, it wasn't the thickness of the armor that decided the fate of the Pacific. It was the depth of the training manuals and the redundancy of the backup valves. The Americans had turned survival into a production line, and that was a science the Imperial Navy simply couldn't defeat. The story of the USS Yorktown at Midway is more than just a military victory. It is the ultimate vindication of American pragmatic logic. For decades, naval history has obsessed over the caliber of the guns and the thickness of the armor plate. But the Pacific War was not won by the ship that couldn't be hit. It was won by the ship that could be resurrected. The Imperial Japanese Navy fought with the soul of the samurai, believing that a single, decisive stroke of divine excellence would shatter their enemy. They built masterpieces of steel and expected them to endure on spirit alone. But spirits don't patch hull breaches, and honor doesn't rewire a shattered electrical grid. While Japan gambled everything on the one big battle, America invested in the one big system. The Yorktown proved that industrial might is not just about how fast you can build a new machine, but how quickly you can keep an old one in the fight. The 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor, the damage control teams in the belly of the ship, and the supply chains stretching across the Pacific were the real weapons of war. They represented a philosophy where quantity and recovery speed were treated as tactical advantages, as lethal as any torpedo. By the end of the war, this industrial endurance would bury the Imperial Navy under an avalanche of steel. Japan could produce legends, but America produced a process. They understood that in a total war, the side that can absorb the most punishment and return to the fray in 48 hours is the side that eventually dictates the peace. The cardboard ship that the Japanese Admirals laughed at in May 1942 became the nightmare that broke their heart in June. It was a lesson in humility delivered by the brute force of American engineering. Ultimately, the conflict was decided by a fundamental difference in belief. The Japanese believed in destiny. The Americans believed in the production line. And as the smoke cleared over Midway, the world realized that destiny is no match for a well-oiled machine. If you want to see how this same logistical machine fueled an entire army across Europe, click here to watch our video on the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy that outran Hitler's Blitz.